Su Chi District, South Vietnam. A 19-year-old with a 28-inch waist lowers himself headfirst into a hole in the jungle floor. He's carrying a pistol and a flashlight. He doesn't have a radio, and nobody's coming behind him. The tunnel is 2 feet wide. He can't see past the beam. He can't turn around. And somewhere ahead of him, in the dark, someone is waiting. That kid had a job title. They called him a tunnel rat. There were roughly 700 of them across the entire war. For a conflict that put 500,000 American troops in country at its peak, that number should tell you something. This was not a popular assignment. It was not something you were ordered into. Every tunnel rat was a volunteer, which honestly raises more questions than it answers. 37 of them were killed. 200 were wounded. For a group that small, those numbers are staggering, one of the highest casualty rates of any specialty in the whole war. And when you understand what they were actually doing down there, the numbers stop being surprising and start being a miracle anyone made it out at all. Let me tell you what the Su Chi tunnels actually were, because the word tunnel doesn't cover it. By the time American forces were operating in Binh Duong province in the mid-1960s, the Viet Cong had been digging under that ground for nearly 20 years. What they built was not a tunnel system. It was an underground city. 250 kilometers of passages, more than the distance from Washington, D.C. to Philadelphia, running 2 and sometimes 3 levels deep beneath the jungle floor. Hospitals down there, kitchens and weapons workshops, command centers. Entire VC units lived underground for months at a stretch without surfacing. The ventilation shafts were so well disguised that American bulldozers drove over them repeatedly without finding them. American forces first stumbled onto the scale of it during Operation Crimp in January 1966. They knew tunnels existed. They had no idea what they were walking over. When the first shafts were found, the Army solution was the obvious one. Throw grenades in, pump in CS gas, blow the entrances. Efficient, fast. Also largely useless, because the tunnels had water trap doors, U-shaped bends that sealed off the gas. The VC just moved deeper, waited, and came back up after the Americans left, which meant someone had to go in. The selection process was essentially self-selection through body type and, there's no polite way to say this, willingness to do something almost nobody wanted to do. 5'5" was roughly the cutoff height, though many rats were shorter. Most were slender. A disproportionate number were Puerto Rican or Mexican-American soldiers, men who tended to be smaller in frame, and who, according to Tom Mangold and John Pennycate's definitive account of the tunnels, often had a cultural familiarity with enclosed spaces and underground agricultural work. That's the history book's framing. The guys themselves probably just said they fit. What they carried going in: 1 pistol, 1 knife, 1 flashlight. That's the whole list. The .45 was standard issue, but a lot of rats quietly swapped it out for something smaller. The .45's muzzle blast in a 2-foot tunnel is roughly equivalent to a flashbang going off next to your ear. Fire it once and you're deaf. In a space where you're moving by sound, listening for breathing, for movement, for the click of a wire, deafness is a death sentence. Some preferred a .38 revolver with a suppressor. A few got their hands on suppressed high-standard .22 automatics left over from OSS stockpiles in World War II. Whatever they could find that was quiet and small. Here's the part that I've read way too many crew reports about, and honestly, I wish I hadn't. The rats stopped smoking and stopped drinking before missions. Not for health reasons, because they needed their senses at full capacity. In a tunnel so narrow you can't raise both arms, with zero light except what your flashlight throws, the thing that keeps you alive is your ears and your nose. The smell of tobacco on your breath could give you away. The smell of enemy tobacco, a different variety, could warn you someone was close. The smell of incense meant a VC altar, which meant a living space nearby. The smell of fish sauce meant food storage. Down there, your nose was doing intelligence work. The booby traps. I have to talk about the booby traps. The simplest ones were tripwired grenades strung across the tunnel at throat height. You're crawling, your flashlight beam is pointed forward, and the wire is at throat level behind the beam. The more elaborate ones were trap doors, hinged sections of the tunnel floor that dropped you into a pit of punji stakes. Sharpened bamboo, often treated with something you don't want to think too hard about. And then there were the snakes. The Viet Cong tethered live snakes to the tunnel walls, bamboo vipers mostly. Called them two-step snakes because the venom drops you in 2 steps. The snakes were tied short enough that they couldn't reach the center of the tunnel if you stayed exactly in the middle, exactly on line. One brush against a wall in the dark and you've got a viper at face height. Some rats came back up with bite marks they couldn't explain until they realized what they'd felt against their arms in the dark. Think about moving through that. No light you can leave on because it marks your position. Going by touch and smell and sound. Every inch of floor is a potential trap. Every inch of wall might be moving. Now here's the thing nobody talks about enough. The underground combat itself. When a tunnel rat ran into a VC fighter down there, the engagement range was measured in inches. Literally. In a 2-foot wide passage, there is no flanking. There is no cover. 2 men face each other in a space where neither can fully extend their arms, and whoever fires first wins, if they can even bring the gun to bear. Several rats reported encounters where both men froze, face to face in the dark, close enough to feel each other's breath, each waiting for the other to move. A few of those stories end with the VC retreating. A few don't end at all. The US Army, to its credit, eventually figured out that this was an actual speciality and tried to formalize it. They trained rats in demolitions so they could destroy what they found. Weapons caches, rice stores, document bunkers. The intelligence value was enormous. The rats pulled maps, plans, personnel rosters, radio codebooks out of those tunnels. In 1967, a team working the Cu Chi complex found a VC headquarters that had been operating for years directly under a US firebase. The Americans had been sleeping above a functioning enemy command center. The tunnel rats found it. By that point, the speciality had developed its own internal culture. They had a motto in terrible fake Latin: non gratum anus rodentum, not worth a rat's ass. It's exactly the kind of joke you'd expect from people doing exactly this kind of job. Grim, self-deprecating, slightly unhinged. They called themselves rats before anyone else could call them something worse. The psychological toll is harder to quantify than the casualty numbers, but it was real. Claustrophobia is an obvious issue, except claustrophobia tended to eliminate itself in the selection process because anyone who couldn't handle tight spaces wouldn't volunteer. What got the ones who stayed was the sustained uncertainty. Every descent into a tunnel was a descent into a space where your training applied almost nowhere. There are no good angles underground. There is no air support. There is no artillery. There is no medevac. If something goes wrong at the 40-meter mark, the only person who can help you is you. After a mission, rats reported that the transition back to surface life was genuinely disorienting. Bright light was painful. Open spaces felt wrong. More than one account describes men sitting with their backs against walls in the mess hall, unable to explain why they couldn't sit in the middle of the room. The army used them throughout the war. As the tunnel network expanded, and it kept expanding, the VC dug faster than anyone could destroy. The demand for rats stayed constant. 700 men across the entire war. The same small pool rotating through the same job for years. The attrition rate guaranteed that by 1969, most of the men going in were relatively new. The veterans who knew the tricks, who developed the instincts were disproportionately dead or wounded or rotated home. Institutional knowledge in that specialty had a short shelf life. The Cu Chi tunnels are a tourist attraction now. You can go visit them. They've widened the entrance shafts so that regular-sized tourists can fit, which should tell you something about the original dimensions. There are replica booby traps, gift shops. You can fire an AK-47 at a range nearby, which is its own kind of bizarre. The guides are very good, and the history is presented thoughtfully, and I've heard it's worth the trip. What the tour doesn't give you, can't give you, is what it was like to go first. To be the guy with the flashlight in a space where no one could follow you fast enough to matter. 700 Americans did that job. 37 didn't come back up. Their motto was, "Not worth a rat's ass." It was a joke, but it wasn't really a joke. It was a thing you say when the actual words, when what you actually went through, don't fit in language. One last detail. A few veterans who were interviewed decades later were asked if they'd do it again, knowing what they knew. Most said they didn't know. Some said no. One said yes. He said going underground was the only time in the war he understood exactly where the enemy was. Everybody else was scared of the open jungle. He was scared of that too. But at least in the tunnels, he said, the threat had a direction.